Lost in Time, Early Alabama Indians. Mississippian Society, the Mound Builders. It was an age of exploration. The Spanish conquistadors had brought back fabulous wealth from their conquests in Mexico and Peru. Seeking more, their eyes turned northward. In 1539, Hernando de Soto, armed with 200 horses, 600 men, a piece of field artillery, and a pack of bloodhounds, made landfall near Tampa Bay. His search for gold and riches led him as far north as present-day North Carolina, and in the warm summer months of 1540, he crossed into Alabama. The year is a significant one, because it is considered the dividing line between the historic and prehistoric periods of Indian culture. Prehistoric means, literally, before history, or written records. The journals kept by members of De Soto's expedition are our first written accounts of southeastern Indian life. The Spanish tell of a populous land of fortified towns and farming villages. They tell of Indian chiefs of gigantic stature and imperial bearing, and of great warriors so formidable they challenged De Soto's well-armed forces in battle. Yet De Soto did not encounter Indian society at the height of its power. He missed that peak by perhaps a century or more. By 1400 AD, a culture archaeologists call Mississippian had already begun to decline, but it left us beautifully crafted works of art, structures of fantastic proportion, and a fascinating chapter of prehistory. Over 1,000 years ago, around 800 AD, the heart of the Mississippi River Valley gave birth to this new and compelling culture. In fact, the largest known Mississippian site is located at Cahokia, across the Mississippi River from St. Louis, Missouri. Whether by massive invasion or just gradual evolution, Mississippian culture spread quickly throughout the southern and eastern parts of the continent. Major civic ceremonial centers sprang up near Spiro, Oklahoma, Etowah, Georgia, and Moundville, Alabama. Impressive even now, the Moundville site was once the center for a magnificent chiefdom that commanded a 50-mile stretch of the Black Warrior River Valley. The largest town in prehistoric Alabama sits on the high bluffs above the river, and one time it housed a resident population of some 3,000, with another 6,000 to 10,000 living in nearby villages. On the 300 acres which lay within the stockade line, there were marketplaces, public plazas, and even game courts. The 20 earthen pyramids which mark its landscape were foundations for council houses, temples, and the home of nobles. The pits which yielded the dirt for the mounds became man-made lakes and were stocked with fish. But the town itself was only the center of the political structure. As Dr. Joseph O. Bogle of the University of Alabama explains, it was supported by a network of small villages and farming hamlets.
Many people come to Mound State Monument, see the Indian mounds there, and think that's all there is. In fact, Moundville was an important center for communities which were scattered throughout the Black Warrior Valley. The society throughout the area was organized on kin lines. That is, every member of the society could trace some sort of relationship to every other member of the chiefdom. And with this relationships came a set of mutual obligations and responsibilities. rank was achieved in relationship to the social distance between one individual and the princely or the chiefly hierarchies. The society itself was organized along the lines of a three-tiered chiefdom. And the way this worked was that at Moundville lived the principal chief, and beneath him were regional chiefs who organized the activities of a number of villages. Each of these villages would be headed by a headman who was closely related to his local regional chief. The effectiveness of this system derived from the fact that decisions, commands would come down the ladder from principal chief through regional chief, who would parcel out decisions and commands to the villages, and the villages would reciprocate with goods and services which were passed back up the system. As a result, towns were constructed and fortified, the mounds were erected, trade was carried on, and religious ceremonies were held.
This complex political structure was built on the basis of a new economic system, agriculture. Maize or corn, originally developed in Central and South America, had spread by way of trade routes throughout the northern continent. Along with beans and squash, it became a diet staple for the Mississippian Indians. They could boil it or roast it, but usually ground it into a meal. This meal was then eaten as porridge or baked into flat cakes. Hunting and fishing continued, as did the gathering of nuts, fruits, and shellfish. But it was man's farming efforts which yielded food surpluses large enough to support the growing population. Like many societies whose survival is dependent on the whims of nature, the Moundville chiefdom developed elaborate religious ceremonies to deal with these unknown forces. There are no eyewitness reports or written records to tell us what form this religious ceremony took, but we know that it provided the stimulus for the construction of the mounds and the creation of elaborate works of art. The pottery produced by the Moundville artisans was among the finest on the continent. Mussel shell was crushed and added to the clay as a tempering agent. The ceramics which resulted were strong, fine-grained, thin-walled, and heat-resistant. Mississippian potters produced a polished black surface using a technique called reduction. By depriving the pot of fresh air containing oxygen as it was fired, the surface would burn and blacken. Conversely, a red surface could be achieved by allowing the pot access to fresh air during firing. Plain bowls and pots were probably for everyday use, but vessels constructed for the nobility or for rituals bore the mark of the artisan. Bowls and jars were made in a variety of shapes or were etched with elaborate designs. These designs, though abstract, dealt directly with nature. A common motif is the sun circle and the cross. The circle is part of the worship of the sun as the source of heat and light, and the cross divides the world into its four quarters. Together, they symbolize the fire sun god. Religious symbolism was also evoked by the hand and the eye. Animals appear frequently in Mississippian pottery. This particular part is called an effigy, meaning that it has a three-dimensional representation of all or part of an animal or human figure. The snake was commonly used. Sometimes the serpent was feathered, similar to the Aztec god Quetzalcoatl. The figure is thought to evoke power and serve as a symbol of war. These artists also crafted jewelry for both men and women. Shell and copper were fashioned into ear ornaments and gorgets or pendants. Despite the masterful skill of these artists, the mounds are Mississippian society's most striking legacy. Majestic even after centuries of decay, they stand as mute sentinels of another age, silent symbols of the power exerted by one of the largest chiefdoms in North America. For years, popular fancy attributed their construction to a number of historic and prehistoric groups ranging from the 10 lost tribes of Israel to visitors from space. And little wonder, to the untrained, the mounds are feats of fantastic proportion. The Temple Mound, the largest at Moundville, stands nearly 60 feet high and holds millions of cubic feet of earth. Even the smaller mounds which surround the central plaza range in height from 12 to 15 feet. In fact, until the construction of the Missouri River dams in the 1950s, the mounds were the largest earthen structures in North America. Remarkable in size, the mounds were time-consuming but simple to construct. Generally, the construction was done in stages. A small mound would be built and a structure placed on top. After a certain time, or after the inhabitants had died, the structure would be destroyed and a new earth piled on top, raising and enlarging the mound. As many as 10 building phases have been recognized in some mounds. Excavation has uncovered burials in some of the mounds. These are believed to be the graves of nobles and their families because of the elaborate array of pottery, jewelry, and other grave goods they contain. It was an exotic society. Noble chiefs exercised authority over an area larger than the modern state of Rhode Island. Priests and shamans offered tribute to the gods in elaborate ceremonies. A town was built in which goods were bought and sold in central marketplaces and competitive games played in spacious plazas. Beautiful works of arts were shaped by trained craftsmen. Monumental earthworks were constructed and fortifications built and maintained. Yet, in an historically brief span of perhaps 100 years, this industrious society was gone, and the busy centers abandoned and silent. Where did they go? What event could have caused such far-reaching upheaval? In fact, there was no plague which felled the people, no battle which laid waste to the town. Archaeologists believe that Mississippian society nurtured the seeds of its own destruction. Dr. Joseph Vogel explains.
We do know that Mississippian economy was based upon the intensive production of maize and other farm products, and that the society was formed to facilitate the flow of goods and services throughout the area. Prestige, status, was achieved by being a close relative of one of the chiefly lineages, and as a result, people contributed their goods, their services, their labor in order to enhance their family prestige and status. In time, though, in this sort of kin-based society, the population grows. Fewer and fewer people have a direct relationship or a close relationship to the chiefly lineage at Moundville. Now, more and more people begin to find themselves estranged. At the same time, bureaucratic costs, the administrative costs of running the society become much greater as the area enclosed becomes greater. As a result of which, goods, services that are flowing up are not reciprocated, are not returned at the same rate that they were earlier. More and more of these costs are being absorbed by the central bureaucracy. As a result, over a period of time, as people find themselves estranged from the status, from the prestige of being a close relative of a chiefly person, they begin to look to people closer at home, people with chiefly ambitions of their own, who are able to reinstitute the redistribution, this flow of goods and services again. And as a result, there's a breakdown. The flow of goods and services into the central capital at Moundville started to break down. The people there were no longer able to sustain the same level or intensity of quality of life that they had been before. Small towns now begin to take on more prestige, more status, and Moundville began to shrink to the level of one of these smaller towns. In time, the Black Warrior Valley was organized around these smaller chiefdoms.
It is a much less dramatic turn of events than some catastrophic act of God or man, but effective nonetheless. Society became simplified, and a period of elaborate cultural expression ended. What new society might have developed from the remnants of Mississippian culture, we can only guess. For the arrival of De Soto signaled the beginning of European exploration and settlement, which would thrust the Indians into the stage of history and change their destiny forever. The story of the prehistoric Indians is one of man measuring up to adversity, meeting the challenge of his environment in various ways, at different times and in different places. From the nomadic life of the paleo hunters to the subtle, sophisticated agricultural society of the Mississippians, adaptation was the key. Man invented new technologies to meet his needs, and he developed new social orders to keep his economy stable. We know only the barest outline of the story. We must base our knowledge on those things the Indians lost or left behind: the spear point, the fragment of pottery, the remains of man himself. It is these things which capture our imagination and lead us to a better understanding of these complex and successful cultures, which for centuries have been lost in time.
This program was made possible by grants from the Lynn Henley Charitable Trust. formed the Committee for the Humanities in Alabama, a state program of the National Endowment for the Humanities. An Auburn Television production.